It began on a quiet morning in late spring, when the dew still clung to the grass and the air smelled faintly of lilacs. The neighborhood of Brookvale Ridge was the kind of place that prided itself on perfection. Rows of identical homes, each with matching mailboxes and evenly spaced trees. Every lawn was manicured, every driveway pressure washed, and every fence built to a precise height dictated by the homeowners association. That morning, the homeowner, Mark Reynolds, opened his front door to find an envelope taped neatly to the frame. The HOA logo, embossed in blue, was unmistakable. It wasn't the first time he'd seen one of these letters. But as he tore it open and scanned the crisp, official wording, something inside him shifted. The letter stated that his wooden privacy fence, newly constructed along the back of his property, violated Section 4B of the HOA's architectural standards. Specifically, it exceeded the approved height by 14 inches. He was given 10 days to correct the violation or face escalating fines and potential legal action. Mark stared at the letter for a long time. He'd built that fence himself, spent weeks designing it, digging posts, and staining every plank. It wasn't just about privacy, it was about peace. After years of dealing with the noise, nosy neighbors, and constant HOA interference, he'd wanted a little sanctuary. And now, they were threatening to take it away. He looked around at the neighborhood. Every home looked the same, every yard carefully measured to fit within invisible boundaries. Brookvale Ridge wasn't a neighborhood, it was a machine run by rules, powered by conformity. And the HOA was its engine. That day, Mark decided he'd had enough. At first, he tried to play by their rules. He wrote letters, attended meetings, and politely argued his case. But the board, the same 5 people who'd been running things for years, refused to budge. They said the fence disrupted the visual harmony of the community. They said it was unwelcoming. They said it projected hostility. In reality, it was none of those things. It was simply different. And in Brookvale Ridge, different was the one thing you weren't allowed to be. The fines started coming in next. $50, then $100, then $200. Each week brought a new warning, a new threat. The letters became more aggressive. The HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Evelyn Carter, even stopped by his house one afternoon, clipboard in hand, to remind him of his obligations as a resident. Mark didn't argue. He just nodded, smiled politely, and closed the door. But behind that calm expression, a plan was forming, one born out of quiet defiance. He realized something that day. They could control how tall his fence was, but they couldn't control what his fence was made of. The HOA rules mentioned wood, vinyl, and wrought iron, but there was nothing about stone, nothing about fortifications, nothing about castles. The idea started as a joke, but the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. Why not? If they wanted to make a spectacle out of his fence, he would give them a spectacle they'd never forget. That night, Mark stayed up late sketching designs. He wasn't an architect, but he had an eye for structure and a stubborn kind of creativity. He pored over images of medieval walls, turrets, crenellations, and parapets, and began imagining what his backyard could become. A fortress, a statement. He calculated costs, called suppliers, and by the end of the week, had a truckload of stone blocks delivered to his driveway. When the neighbors saw it, whispers started immediately. Some thought he was landscaping. Others thought he was building a retaining wall. No one could have guessed what was coming next. The first layer went up easily, heavy, square stones forming a sturdy base. Then came the mortar, the chiseling, the shaping. He worked from dawn until dusk, ignoring the curious stares and the occasional HOA inspector passing by. As the wall grew taller, so did the rumors. By the time the structure reached 6 feet, people began to notice it wasn't just a wall. It was art. Intricate carvings appeared in the stone, each one unique. Gargoyle-like figures perched along the top, their faces etched in quiet defiance. The wall curved around his yard like a fortress protecting a castle that didn't yet exist. The HOA notices kept coming, of course. They accused him of unauthorized construction and community disruption. They demanded blueprints, permits, and explanations. But Mark gave them none. Each letter he received went straight into a growing stack on his kitchen counter, a paper monument to their control. Soon, local residents began driving by just to see it. Some loved it, calling it the Brookvale Castle. Others despised it, calling it a monstrosity. But everyone was talking about it. One morning, a photographer from a local newspaper showed up, asking to feature it in a quirky home improvement column. Mark agreed, on one condition, that they tell the truth, that this wasn't just art. It was protest. When the article ran, it went viral overnight. Man builds castle wall after HOA, says his fence is too tall. People across the country cheered him on. Social media dubbed him the castle guy. Memes spread, hashtags trended, and for the first time in his life, Mark felt like he was winning. But the HOA didn't see it that way. The next morning, he woke to find a notice stapled to his front door, bigger and bolder than ever. This time, it wasn't just about fines. It was a formal demand for demolition. They called the wall a violation of structural integrity, safety standards, and community aesthetic guidelines. They gave him 30 days to tear it down or face a lawsuit. Mark stared at the notice for a long time, the morning sun catching the edges of the stapled paper. His hands were still dusty from mortar, his back sore from work. But in his chest, there was a steady fire burning now, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished by legal threats or HOA rules. He folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and looked at the wall rising before him. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a statement, a challenge, a symbol of everything the HOA wanted to suppress. And he wasn't about to stop now. By the time the second week rolled around, Mark's home no longer looked like part of the neighborhood. The line of ordinary vinyl fences and pastel-painted exteriors ended abruptly at his property, where a gray, stony fortress rose from the earth like something out of a medieval dream. What had begun as a protest was now a landmark, and Brookvale Ridge was split right down the middle. Half of the community saw Mark as a hero, a man standing up to the suffocating control of the HOA. The other half saw him as a troublemaker, a rule breaker threatening to drag down their property values and the image of their perfect, uniform paradise. The HOA board, of course, fell squarely in the latter category. Evelyn Carter, the president, had convened an emergency meeting the night after Mark's story went viral. She and the other board members sat in the clubhouse, a sterile room filled with beige walls and fake plants, and discussed the growing problem. The word they used most often was embarrassment. Brookvale Ridge had always been marketed as a model community. Now, thanks to Mark, it was a punchline on national television. Their first step was intimidation. They started sending contractors to inspect the property. They called city code enforcement, hoping to find a loophole or violation. They even tried to have the construction halted under the guise of safety concerns. But Mark had done his homework. Every part of his project followed local building laws to the letter. He'd even obtained a special permit from the county for a decorative stone wall, just in case. Every time the HOA thought they had him cornered, they discovered he'd already anticipated their move. Still, they weren't ready to give up. Evelyn knew that if Mark's wall remained standing, it would set a precedent, one that could unravel their entire system of control. Meanwhile, Mark kept building. The wall grew higher, thicker, stronger. He added towers on each corner, small, rounded extensions that gave the illusion of turrets. It wasn't just functional anymore. It was beautiful. The stones, uneven and weathered, caught the light differently each day. Moss began to creep into the crevices, giving it a sense of age, as if it had always belonged there. Passers-by stopped daily to take photos. Families parked their cars just to get a glimpse. Kids pointed excitedly, calling it the Castle House. Even tourists from nearby towns began showing up, curious to see the viral sensation in person. Mark didn't charge admission or promote it himself, but word spread faster than he could control. A small ice cream truck even started parking near the street corner on weekends, taking advantage of the growing crowd. The HOA hated every second of it. Complaints poured into their inbox, though not about the wall itself. Most came from residents angry about the traffic, the noise, and the influx of outsiders. They blamed Mark for disrupting their peace, for turning Brookvale Ridge into a spectacle. Yet what none of them admitted was that their neighborhood had never truly been peaceful. It had been silent, the kind of silence built from fear of standing out. And now, Mark's wall had broken that silence forever. Evelyn's next move was escalation. She filed a formal civil complaint against Mark on behalf of the HOA, alleging that his wall posed a safety hazard and did not conform to community standards. It was in essence a threat to take him to court. But something unexpected happened when the news broke. The story spread again, only this time it wasn't just local. National outlets picked it up, framing it as a David and Goliath struggle between a homeowner and a power-hungry HOA. Interviews, op-eds, and think pieces appeared online with titles like "Man Builds Castle to Defend His Freedom" and "When Homeowners Fight Back." For the first time, public opinion turned squarely against the HOA. They tried to defend themselves, releasing a carefully worded statement about maintaining community harmony. But the internet had already made up its mind. Evelyn Carter was branded a real-life Karen, and the HOA was painted as the villain in a suburban fairy tale. And in many ways, it was true. As the wall neared completion, Mark added a final flourish, a heavy, arched wooden gate at the front, reinforced with iron hinges. Above it, carved into stone, were 3 simple words: "My home, my castle." It was defiance turned into architecture. Neighbors gathered to watch him finish it, some cheering quietly, others glaring in silence. One elderly couple brought folding chairs and sat on the sidewalk, sipping lemonade as though watching a parade. It was a moment that felt larger than just one man and his fence. It was a statement against every petty rule, every condescending warning letter, every neighbor who had ever been told to keep things uniform. But the more the wall drew admiration, the more desperate the HOA became. They called another emergency meeting, this time inviting the town's mayor to mediate. Evelyn argued that the structure threatened the identity of Brookvale Ridge, that it was making a mockery of their values. The mayor listened politely, but reminded them that Mark's wall was legal, and frankly, that it had put their community on the map. Evelyn was furious. Her control was slipping. The HOA's authority, once absolute, now looked fragile. People were beginning to question their rules, their fees, even their necessity. Some residents openly suggested disbanding the association altogether, and that terrified her. In the weeks that followed, tension grew thicker than ever. HOA board members began patrolling the neighborhood, photographing suspicious activity. They issued citations for uncut grass, faded paint, and improperly stored trash bins. It was retaliation, pure and simple, a reminder to everyone that they still had power. But their authority was hollow now. More and more homeowners started pushing back, refusing to pay fines or attending meetings to demand transparency. The unity the HOA once forced was unraveling, replaced by something much more powerful: independence. Through it all, Mark kept working quietly behind his stone wall. He didn't speak to reporters anymore. He didn't need to. The wall spoke for him. One night, long after sunset, Evelyn drove by his house. She sat in her car, headlights off, staring at the silhouette of the fortress that had become her obsession. Its shadow loomed across the street like a monument to her failure. The next morning, when Mark stepped outside, he found a new letter waiting on his porch. Not taped neatly this time, but crumpled, hastily stuffed into the doorframe. It wasn't from the HOA office. It was handwritten. The message was short, angry, and personal, and it promised that the wall wouldn't stand much longer. The warning note stayed on Mark's kitchen counter all day. Its crude handwriting and childish threat made him uneasy, but he refused to let fear dictate his next move. He had faced HOA lawyers, city inspectors, and online trolls. A handwritten note wasn't going to shake him. Still, something about the way it was delivered, no envelope, no signature, told him this was personal. As the sun dipped behind the hills that evening, the castle wall cast long, uneven shadows across the yard. The stone glowed faintly gold in the fading light, looking almost ancient, like it had stood there for centuries. It was a monument to Mark's persistence, but also a target for resentment. The neighborhood had changed since the wall went up. It wasn't just about fences or property lines anymore. There was a quiet hostility now. Whispers at mailboxes, sideways glances during morning jogs, and the faint tension that came whenever a car slowed down in front of his home. That night, the air felt different. Still, heavy. Mark sat inside, watching a late-night show with the volume low. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. Then, around midnight, he heard it. A faint metallic clang, followed by the sound of gravel crunching under hurried footsteps. He turned off the TV. Silence. Then another sound, closer this time. A scrape of metal against stone. He moved quietly to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. Under the pale glow of a street lamp, two shadowy figures stood near the far corner of the wall. One on the crowbar. The other was crouched, doing something at the base of the structure. Mark's stomach turned cold. They weren't kids messing around. This was deliberate. He didn't yell. He didn't confront them. Instead, he grabbed his phone and opened the camera app connected to his new outdoor security system. The same one he'd installed after the HOA first began harassing him. Every inch of the property was covered, every angle recorded. He watched as the two figures pried at a section of the wall, trying to loosen the mortar. They worked fast, nervously glancing over their shoulders. One of them whispered something, then pointed toward the gate. They weren't just trying to vandalize it. They were trying to bring it down. The next moment, a loud crack echoed through the night as a piece of stone came loose. The sound startled them. One stumbled backward, tripping over a bucket, while the other hissed angrily for silence. Then, headlights. A car turned onto the street, its beams sweeping across the wall. The intruders froze, then bolted, disappearing into the darkness between houses. Mark didn't chase them. He didn't have to. The cameras had caught everything. Faces, tools, license plates. He spent the next hour reviewing the footage, frame by frame. His jaw clenched as he recognized one of the saboteurs, Jason Miller, the HOA's vice president. The second man was harder to identify, but his build and posture looked familiar, possibly one of the landscaping contractors the HOA frequently hired. It wasn't just petty vandalism anymore. It was organized. The following morning, Mark called the police. Officers arrived, took statements, and reviewed the footage. Their reaction was professional but unmistakably impressed. It wasn't every day someone tried to siege a suburban home. By noon, Jason Miller had been brought in for questioning. The HOA board was thrown into chaos. Evelyn Carter, the president, called an emergency meeting, insisting it was a misunderstanding. But the damage was done, literally and figuratively. Local news stations picked up the story again, this time under headlines like, HOA Vice President Caught Sabotaging Homeowner's Castle Wall. Reporters camped outside the entrance to Brookvale Ridge, eager for statements. Cameras flashed as Evelyn tried to push past them, muttering no comment through clenched teeth. Inside the community, alliances began to shift. Homeowners who once supported the HOA now whispered about resignations and lawsuits. Others, emboldened by Mark's defiance, began ignoring petty citations altogether. Mark repaired the damaged section of his wall himself. As he worked, people stopped by, not to gawk this time, but to help. A few brought snacks, others tools, and one man even offered to bring in extra stone from his own backyard project. The castle wall had become more than a boundary. It was a symbol of rebellion. Evelyn saw it differently. To her, it was a contagion, a growing threat to the control she'd built over the years. Each act of defiance was like a crack spreading through the HOA's foundation. That evening, she sat alone in her office, scrolling through messages from angry residents. Some demanded Jason's resignation. Others demanded hers. One even suggested dissolving the HOA altogether. Evelyn's face tightened. She couldn't let that happen. Not after everything she'd built. She stared at the photo of Mark's wall on her computer screen. The turrets, the stonework, the massive gate. It all mocked her authority. To her, it wasn't a home improvement project. It was a declaration of war. She began drafting a new plan, a final attempt to destroy Mark's fortress from within the law. This time, She wouldn't rely on shady tactics or angry letters. She would go through the courts, lobbying local officials to declare the wall a public nuisance and architectural hazard. But what Evelyn didn't realize was that her every move was now being watched. Not by Mark, but by the growing public that had taken his side. Meanwhile, Mark was starting to feel the weight of everything. The attention, the tension, the endless back and forth. It was exhausting. The wall had started as a joke, a protest. Now it was his life's defining act. And though he tried not to admit it, the thought of what might come next worried him. Because Evelyn wasn't the type to back down. And if she couldn't destroy the wall in the dark, she'd try to tear it down in daylight. Piece by piece, through the system she ruled so well. Late that night, Mark stood outside by the gate, running his hand along the rough stone surface. The stars were faint, hidden by thin clouds. The wall loomed quietly around him, solid and immovable. He didn't know it yet, but the next battle wouldn't be fought with crowbars or threats. It would be fought in courtrooms, in headlines, and in hearts. The siege had just begun. The week following the sabotage felt deceptively calm. No more mysterious noises in the night, no more threatening notes, and no more direct confrontations. The sun shone brightly over Brookvale Ridge, and the streets seemed to hum with uneasy normalcy. But Mark knew better. He had seen that look in Evelyn Carter's eyes at the last HOA meeting. Sharp, calculating, the look of someone who was already 2 steps ahead. She wasn't finished. If anything, Jason's arrest had only fueled her determination. And sure enough, her next move came not from the shadows, but wrapped in a crisp, white envelope, stamped with official seals. It was a lawsuit. The HOA was formally suing Mark for architectural violation, community disruption, and unauthorized construction exceeding approved height and material restrictions. The language was cold and technical, but the intent was crystal clear. They wanted the wall gone, once and for all. The notice went further than before. It cited zoning ordinances, municipal codes, and even referenced neighborhood aesthetic cohesion, a term Evelyn had practically invented during her tenure. According to the claim, Mark's fortress-like construction diminished neighboring property values, violated the community's visual harmony, and posed potential safety hazards due to its weight and height. It was absurd. Every claim was either exaggerated or fabricated, but the legal machinery had started turning, and once it did, it was hard to stop. Within days, Evelyn was back in her element, parading through meetings, smiling for cameras, and giving interviews about restoring peace to the neighborhood. She framed herself as the protector of the community, the one standing up to a defiant homeowner who had turned their quiet suburb into a spectacle. Mark, on the other hand, became the reluctant underdog in a public feud that grew bigger every day. Local news stations aired split-screen footage. On one side, Evelyn in her blazer, speaking about regulations and order, and on the other, Mark standing beside his stone wall, hands crossed, looking defiant yet exhausted. Social media took sides instantly. Memes flooded online. Castle Guy versus HOA Queen. The phrase stuck. The irony was the more Evelyn pushed, the more people rallied behind Mark. The lawsuit backfired in public perception. Journalists began digging deeper into Brookvale Ridge's HOA history, uncovering years of petty fines, selective enforcement, and instances of Evelyn targeting specific homeowners over minor infractions. Still, the legal fight pressed on. Mark's days turned into a blur of paperwork, attorney consultations, and sleepless nights. The cost of defending himself grew by the week. He was proud of his wall, but it wasn't just stone. It was now the center of a storm that threatened to swallow his peace entirely. Meanwhile, Evelyn's control began slipping. The board meetings she once ruled with iron precision were now scenes of open conflict. Members questioned her leadership, bringing up Jason's vandalism charges and her obsession with Mark's wall. Evelyn dismissed them with tight smiles, insisting the lawsuit was for the good of everyone. But even her allies started to waver. Residents who once feared the HOA began speaking up. One woman, Mrs. Langley, stood during a meeting and described how Evelyn had fined her for a non-regulation flower pot. Another neighbor admitted he'd been threatened with a lien for having his Christmas lights up 2 days past deadline. The tide was turning, but Evelyn refused to see it. She doubled down, calling in city inspectors, structural engineers, and code enforcement officers to comb through Mark's property. Trucks and clipboards became a daily sight around his driveway. One by one, each report came back the same: no violations. The wall was sturdy, safe, and built within his property line. Mark had done everything by the book. But Evelyn wasn't fighting with facts anymore. She was fighting with pride. In desperation, she filed an emergency motion to have the wall declared a temporary public safety concern. It was a reach. She knew it, but it bought her time. The case gained a new hearing, and for a brief moment, she believed she might still win. That belief shattered when an anonymous whistleblower leaked HOA emails to the local press. The emails showed Evelyn coordinating with Jason weeks before the sabotage attempt, discussing alternative methods to deal with the wall problem. One message even mentioned removing a few stones to make a point. It was damning. The story exploded online overnight. Suddenly, the narrative flipped completely. Evelyn went from community hero to villain almost instantly. The HOA's credibility crumbled. Residents flooded social media with their own horror stories, painting a picture of an organization ruled by intimidation and pettiness. Within days, Evelyn was forced to step down as president, pending investigation. Jason's charges were upgraded to include property damage and conspiracy. The HOA scrambled to contain the chaos, but it was too late. Their reputation was gone. Mark watched it all unfold from his living room. He didn't celebrate, not outwardly. The relief was slow and quiet, like a long exhale after holding his breath for too long. The lawsuit still lingered, but without Evelyn's influence, the board lacked the motivation and funding to continue. The case was dismissed shortly after. When Mark walked outside that morning, he noticed something he hadn't seen in months. Neighbors smiling at him without hesitation. Some even waved. The tension that had once suffocated the street was gone, replaced by something lighter. The wall still stood, towering and proud, but now it wasn't a symbol of defiance. It was a landmark. People came by to take pictures. Families stopped during walks to admire the craftsmanship. It became a quirky point of pride for Brookvale Ridge, the story of how one man's protest became a monument to perseverance. But Evelyn wasn't finished. Not completely. Rumors began swirling that she planned to appeal the case on her own, separate from the HOA. Some claimed she'd started attending city council meetings under a different name. Others said she'd moved away entirely. Mark didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain. She was not the type to disappear quietly. And while peace seemed to return to Brookvale Ridge, the scars of the feud lingered beneath the surface. Mark had won the battle, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the war wasn't truly over. Because people like Evelyn never really lost, they just waited for another chance to strike. And in the calm that followed, a new storm was already gathering on the horizon. For a while, Brookvale Ridge existed in a strange kind of peace. The HOA was fractured, its board gutted and uncertain, its reputation still recovering from the scandal that had gone public. Without Evelyn Carter at the helm, the once feared organization drifted like a ship without a captain. Letters went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Rules that had been enforced with militant precision were now ignored entirely. Mark, at last, found himself able to breathe. The wall stood untouched, a symbol not only of his resistance, but of his victory. The same neighbors who once whispered behind curtains now strolled past with admiration. Families took photos in front of it. Tourists occasionally drove through just to see the castle wall house. But peace in Brookvale Ridge was always temporary. It began with rumors, small, uncertain, but unsettling. Evelyn Carter had been seen again, not in Brookvale Ridge directly, but close. Someone claimed to have spotted her at the nearby municipal building, speaking to a zoning commissioner. Another said they saw her at a real estate seminar in town, dressed sharply and taking notes. Most people dismissed it. After all, Evelyn had been humiliated publicly, her credibility destroyed, her name synonymous with overreach and obsession. What could she possibly do now? Mark tried to believe that too. He wanted to. But late one afternoon, as he sorted through his mail, he noticed something that made his stomach twist. A thick manila envelope, unmarked, resting neatly atop his stack of letters. He tore it open and froze. Inside was a glossy brochure from a new neighborhood restoration committee, claiming to be dedicated to restoring order, property value, and community integrity. The logo was new, the design modern, but the mission statement read like something Evelyn herself would have written. At the bottom, in neat script, was a name, E. Carter, Interim Director. She was back, not through the HOA, but through a new front, one designed to bypass its ruined reputation. It wasn't illegal, and that made it worse. This wasn't the old HOA, bound by bylaws and oversight. This was a private community alliance, run under the guise of beautification, but with the same controlling intent. Within weeks, flyers began appearing on doors, promising restored community values and voluntary compliance programs. Some homeowners ignored them. Others, weary of the chaos that had followed the HOA's collapse, started attending her information sessions. And slowly, the tide began to shift again. Evelyn's meetings were polished and persuasive. She didn't rant or scold this time. She smiled, spoke softly, and positioned herself as a victim of misunderstanding. A woman who had only ever wanted to protect the neighborhood from unsightly developments and non-compliant structures. She never mentioned Mark by name, but everyone knew who she meant. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Evelyn wasn't trying to fight him directly anymore. She was rebuilding her influence from the ground up, neighbor by neighbor, vote by vote. By the end of the month, her committee had gathered enough signatures to propose new aesthetic guidelines to the city council. The motion included stricter controls on exterior modifications, fence heights, and unapproved materials. It was the same battle, dressed in new words. When Mark heard the news, he felt a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. He had fought this war once. He didn't want to do it again. But the thought of Evelyn regaining control, of undoing everything he'd built, reignited something in him. This time, he wasn't going to be reactive. He was going to be strategic. He began documenting everything, every flyer, every statement, every new policy Evelyn proposed. He created a small website called the Brookvale Files and uploaded every record he could find about the HOA's past abuses. Then, with the help of a few tech-savvy neighbors, he began sharing the link across local forums and social media groups. Within days, the old ghosts of Evelyn's leadership were revived in the public eye. News outlets picked it up again. HOA president returns with new committee, residents concerned. The story went viral faster than before, and Evelyn's carefully rebuilt image began to crack. But Evelyn had anticipated backlash. When reporters reached out for comment, she didn't deny her past. Instead, she reframed it. She spoke calmly about personal growth, about learning from mistakes, and about her commitment to healing the community. She even went so far as to say that the wall, Mark's wall, had inspired her to think differently about creative expression within neighborhoods. It was infuriating. She had turned the very thing she tried to destroy into a prop for her redemption arc. And somehow it worked. A surprising number of residents began to sympathize with her. They said she'd been treated too harshly, that maybe she was just doing her job. The line between villain and victim blurred, and soon enough, her committee started to gain traction again. Mark realized that he wasn't just fighting for his wall anymore. He was fighting for the truth, the real story behind what had happened. So, he decided to take it further. He invited a documentary crew, the same local news team that had covered his first feud, to come back. This time, they wouldn't just film his wall. They'd tell the entire saga, from the HOA's rise and fall to Evelyn's reemergence. Filming began quietly, but Evelyn caught wind of it. She tried to block it, calling it defamatory. Her lawyers sent letters, threatening to sue. But legally, she had no grounds. Everything Mark and the journalists discussed was factual and verifiable. The documentary premiered online 3 months later. It was titled The Wall That Broke the HOA. Within 24 hours, it had over 2 million views. Comments flooded in from people across the country. Homeowners sharing their own stories of power-hungry HOAs, neighbors cheering Mark's defiance, and countless messages calling Evelyn out by name. The fallout was swift. The city council quietly shelved Evelyn's proposed guidelines, citing community division. Sponsors pulled out of her restoration committee. Her public image, carefully rebuilt over months, shattered again, this time beyond repair. Mark didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken louder than anything he could have said. As weeks passed, the neighborhood finally began to heal for real. The committee dissolved, Evelyn stopped appearing in public, and her house eventually went up for sale. On the day moving trucks arrived at her home, Mark stood at his window, watching quietly. There was no satisfaction in seeing her go, only closure. The long, bitter feud that had consumed their lives was finally ending. Yet as the last box disappeared into the truck and the taillights faded down the street, Mark turned back toward his wall. It wasn't just stone and mortar anymore. It was history, the physical embodiment of standing up when everyone else gave in. The battle was over. But the story of the castle wall was far from finished, because soon that story would take on a life of its own. Months passed. The chaos that had once defined Brookvale Ridge finally began to fade into memory. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the neighborhood felt quiet, peaceful, even. Evelyn Carter had sold her home and moved away, leaving behind only whispers and a legacy of bitterness that few dared to revisit. The HOA, once feared and loathed, was dissolved entirely. In its place, a small volunteer neighborhood committee formed, one dedicated to maintenance and community events, not rules and punishments. Gone were the warning letters, the fines, the measuring tapes, and the threats. In their absence, something unexpected blossomed: unity. And at the center of it all stood Mark's wall. No longer a symbol of defiance or rebellion. It had become something else, a landmark, a monument to perseverance. A story that had transcended Brookvale Ridge and captured the imagination of people far beyond it. The documentary, The Wall That Broke the HOA, had continued to spread online. It was featured in local papers, then in national outlets. Before long, it caught the attention of producers from a popular streaming network specializing in real-life community conflicts and human interest stories. They reached out to Mark with an offer: a full-length docuseries exploring the rise and fall of HOAs across America, centered around his story. At first, Mark hesitated. He wasn't interested in fame or attention. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this was an opportunity to turn something ugly into something meaningful, to expose a broken system and maybe even help others facing the same struggles he had endured. He agreed. The filming took months. Crews came and went, setting up cameras, interviewing neighbors, and capturing the day-to-day life of Brookvale Ridge as it found its footing again. The wall became their backdrop, a silent witness to everything that had happened, its rough stone surface catching the morning light like something sacred. When the docuseries finally premiered, the response was overwhelming. It wasn't just entertainment. It became a conversation. People across the country began sharing their own HOA horror stories. Boards abusing power, presidents harassing residents, neighbors turned enemies over trivial rules. The wall had started as one man's act of defiance, but it had grown into a national symbol of standing up against unjust authority. Visitors began coming from out of town, families, journalists, even tourists with cameras. Some called it the Fortress of Freedom. Others, more playfully, called it Mark's Castle. The city eventually added it to a list of local points of interest. At first, Mark found it strange, people taking photos outside his home, posing by the stone gate, laughing, smiling. But over time, he came to appreciate it. The wall no longer separated him from the community. It connected him to it. The neighborhood changed, too. Without the HOA's oppressive presence, residents began expressing themselves freely. Houses were painted in brighter colors. Lawns bloomed with wildflowers and custom gardens. One family even built a small fairy tale turret playhouse in their backyard, calling it a mini tribute to Mark's wall. The rigid, sterile uniformity that Evelyn had fought so hard to maintain was gone, and no one missed it. Every now and then, Mark would receive a letter from strangers who had seen the documentary. Some thanked him for inspiring them to challenge their HOAs. Others sent photos of their own creative fences or home projects. One man from Arizona wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to tell my HOA to back off. I didn't build a wall, but I planted a jungle instead." It made Mark smile. But amid all the positivity, he sometimes caught himself reflecting on how close it had all come to ruin. How a simple fence dispute had spiraled into sabotage, lawsuits, and public scandal. It was strange, he thought, how quickly ordinary life could turn into something extraordinary, and how power could twist even the most peaceful communities into battlegrounds. Still, the scars of that war were fading now. One crisp autumn morning, Mark stood outside, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight crawl across the stone surface of the wall. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet except for the faint sound of children playing down the street. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The gate creaked open behind him. It was his new neighbor, a young couple who had recently moved in. They waved as they passed, smiling warmly. They didn't mention the wall, or the documentary, or the drama that had once defined the street. To them, this was just a neighborhood, a normal one. And that, Mark realized, was the greatest victory of all. A few weeks later, the city hosted a small community fair, held for the first time on the open lawn just a few blocks from Mark's house. There were booths, games, food trucks, and a live band. The mayor gave a short speech about growth through resilience, ending with a lighthearted acknowledgement of Brookvale Ridge's most famous resident. As laughter filled the crowd, Mark noticed a familiar face in the distance. For a split second, his chest tightened. It was Evelyn Carter. She stood at the edge of the gathering, dressed casually, no longer the commanding presence she once was. Her expression wasn't angry or bitter. It was something else, tired, maybe even remorseful. Their eyes met briefly. She gave a small nod, one that seemed to say it's over. Mark nodded back. That was enough. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, and that was the last time he ever saw her. As the sun dipped low and the fair lights twinkled on, Mark found himself surrounded by laughter and music. He looked toward his house in the distance, the outline of the castle wall faintly visible against the sky. What had begun as rebellion had become a legacy, a reminder that sometimes standing your ground wasn't about winning or losing. It was about proving that no one could take away your right to build your own peace, your own dream, even if it looked like a castle in the suburbs. And so, the wall remained, not as a barrier, but as a beacon, a monument not to defiance, but to freedom. The legend of the man who turned a fence into a fortress would live on long after the last stone weathered in the rain. Because every brick told a story, every scar had meaning, and every battle, no matter how small, could echo far beyond its walls.